Now, DNS actually supports a very large list of possible record types, but there are a smaller number of those that are important for you to know because they're the ones that are used most commonly in a Windows environment. DNS has been around for a very long time, and so there's a lot of other records that have just kind of stuck around as artifacts of a time gone past. So the ones that you got to be aware of, at least for the exam, and probably most often for the entirety of your administration of this Windows environment, begin with the A and quadruple A records. And these are essentially the same thing, except the A record has to do with IPv4 and the quadruple A has to do with IPv6. When you create a new record for a server, that server's record is traditionally an A record or quad A record. And so that's the kind of primary entry point by which a client can then find a server. If you do an NS lookup against a server, by default, it's doing that NS lookup against that server's A record. But that's not the only kind of records that exist out there. There are also CNAME records, which are used when you need to give a server an additional name. A lot of us have our servers named after something that makes it easy for us to remember, like DEN-web1-whatever. And so these very long lists of sometimes complex names are great for us in IT because it helps us identify what the server is. But a lot of times our users would prefer something a little more friendly. A CNAME provides a way for you to give what is essentially a nickname for a server. So DEN-web1-whatever could just simply be shortened to www. You find yourself using these CNAMEs a lot when you don't want to change the actual name of the server, but you want to provide an alternative name that, again, is a little more friendly for users to use. We won't talk too much about mail exchange records here, but if you're doing any kind of work with Exchange or SMTP or any of the other ways in which mail gets routed, an MX record is just another record, usually sits right next to the A record, that lets incoming clients know that that server happens to be a mail server. You will only find mail exchange records when there's some form of SMTP or Exchange or other mail services that exist on a machine. Now, an NS record and also a start of authority record are used to define which machine is responsible for a particular zone. The name server is just literally a DNS name server. So that can be a machine that is a name server and can respond to any requests. A pointer record is a reverse record. There are a lot of other uses for pointer records, but at least in the Windows world, you can identify a PTR record as pretty much exclusively a reverse record, or the ability to turn an IP address into a fully qualified domain name. Anytime you're doing NS lookup against, DEN-web1, and you get that IP address back, that's going to be the A record response. But if you need to do NS lookup for a 192.168.0.1, when you perform that kind of query, that's when you're querying against a PTR record. These PTR records are not necessarily created by default, but in just about every case when you create one here in the DNS console, it's pretty much a good idea for you to create the reverse record as well. PTR records aren't used all that often in the Windows world. They are used for a couple of special circumstances, like being able to, again, find a server name from its IP address. They can be used to help servers identify what site they're in. Some pieces of group policy, site-driven group policy, also require PTR records. So whereas some guidance out there recommends not using PTR records, it's my personal opinion that it doesn't hurt, and it can come in handy in certain circumstances if you include those PTR records in your DNS zones. Your start of authority record is another record that kind of works with your NS records in that the start of authority record determines which machine is responsible or authoritative for a particular zone. So for us, company.pri, the start of authority record right now includes that server DC. Here in just a minute, we'll talk about how we can query on SOA records as well as the other kinds of records that exist so that you can determine who actually is the start of authority for a particular DNS zone. And then lastly are SRV records, which got a lot of attention when Active Directory first came out over a decade ago. SRV records are a way to identify not necessarily specific machines, but specific services on those machines. SRV records are used most commonly by Active Directory and, in most cases, Active Directory alone. You will find some applications sometimes that will create their own SRV records, but for the most part, Active Directory is the biggest consumer and creator of the SRV records in your Active Directory zones. And we'll poke through here in just a second to show you where those SRV records actually exist.